Today we are going to explore one of the greatest enigmas inherited from the Middle Ages, the true fate of the fortune amassed by the Knights Templar throughout nearly 2 centuries of existence. We will follow, from their birth on the roads of Jerusalem to their end at the stakes of Paris, the trajectory of an order that became so wealthy and so feared that the King of France himself decided to destroy it. Before we continue, remember to subscribe to the channel to follow more documentary narratives like this one. At the beginning of the 12th century, the roads leading to Jerusalem were long, dusty, and dangerous. Ever since the armies of the First Crusade had taken the Holy City in 1099, thousands of Christian pilgrims from all over Europe had been crossing mountains, deserts, and narrow passes to reach the holy places. Many never completed the journey. Bandits ambushed entire groups in the gorges of Palestine, and the protection offered by the newly formed Kingdom of Jerusalem was not enough to cover such a vast extent of territory. It was in this scenario of faith, danger, and improvisation that a small group of French knights decided to act. Around 1119, a nobleman from the Champagne region named Hugues de Payens gathered some companions in arms with an unusual proposal for the time to form a brotherhood of warriors who would take religious vows like monks, but who would also wield the sword in defense of pilgrims. The idea was, at the same time, simple and revolutionary. Until then, the Church clearly separated the world of prayer from the world of war. Those men proposed uniting the two. Hugues de Payens presented the plan to King Baldwin II of Jerusalem and to the Patriarch of the city. Both accepted the proposal, and the monarch granted the few knights a space within what was believed to be the ancient Temple of Solomon, erected on the city's sacred mount. From there would be born the name by which they would be known forever, the Knights of the Temple, or simply Templars. Their official name, however, was more modest and revealed the original spirit of the foundation. Poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. During the first few years, the order lived up to its name. Accounts of the time describe knights who shared a single horse between 2 men due to a lack of resources, and who depended almost entirely on donations to survive. They were few, poor, and practically unknown outside of circles close to the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Nothing at that moment suggested that that small group would become, within a few decades, one of the wealthiest and most influential forces in all of Christendom. The turning point began to take shape when Hugues de Payens returned to Europe in search of support, official recognition, and new members. He found a powerful ally in the figure of Bernard of Clairvaux, a Cistercian abbot of enormous spiritual and political prestige, and also a relative of one of the founding knights. Bernard would later write a treatise called In Praise of the New Knighthood, defending the idea that fighting in defense of the Christian faith under certain conditions was not a sin, but rather an act of virtue. His words would give the young order a legitimacy that no common army possessed, that of warriors who served God with the sword. In January 1129, an ecclesiastical council of great importance gathered in the French city of Troyes. Archbishops, bishops, and abbots from the main dioceses of the region joined under the presence of Bernard of Clairvaux to debate and formalize the rules of life for the new military order. The meeting resulted in the Latin Rule, a set of articles that determined everything from the number of horses each knight could own to the hours of silence during meals. The Templars thus began to exist officially as a religious and military order recognized by the Church. From Troyes, everything changed in pace. Pope Innocent II granted the order extraordinary privileges. The Templars were exempt from local taxes, could cross borders freely, and answered only to the direct authority of the Pope, rather than to the bishops or nobles of each region. This independence, added to the prestige of fighting for the faith in Holy Lands, transformed the order into a natural destination for donations. Kings, counts, and noble families from all over Europe began to grant lands, castles, mills, vineyards, and sums of money to the Templars in the hope of securing spiritual favor, and at the same time supporting the cause of the Crusades. Within a few decades, what had begun as a small road guard had transformed into a network stretching from Scotland to Jerusalem, passing through France, the Iberian Peninsula, England, and the territories of the Holy Roman Empire. Each of these properties, called preceptories or commanderies, functioned as an outpost of the order, managing lands, recruiting new members, collecting revenues, and sending resources to sustain the knights fighting in the east. It was precisely this decentralized structure, spread across dozens of different kingdoms, that gave rise to one of the most remarkable innovations in medieval economic history. Pilgrims, who needed to travel long distances, ran great risks by carrying gold and silver coins with them, an easy target for highwaymen. The Templars realized they could solve this problem by offering a service hitherto unprecedented on such a scale. A traveler would deposit their assets at a preceptory in Europe and receive a sealed document, a kind of letter of credit. Upon arriving in the Holy Land, they would present this document at another preceptory of the order and receive the corresponding value without needing to physically transport a single coin along the way. This system of value transfer, based on trust, written records, and a network of coordinated posts, made the Templars something akin to international bankers long before this concept formally existed in Europe. Kings began to turn to them to guard royal treasuries, finance wars, and manage tax collections. The French crown itself, for a period, kept part of its treasury under the guard of the order within the fortress known as the Templar de Paris, built on the banks of the Seine River. That structure, with its great fortified tower, became a symbol of the financial power the order had accumulated, functioning almost as a central bank of the Middle Ages. Meanwhile, in the East, the Templars continued to fulfill their original role, defending what remained of the Christian territories conquered during the First Crusade. They participated in practically all the great battles and sieges of the following decades, building and garrisoning strategic fortresses that can still be visited today in parts of modern-day Lebanon, Syria, and Israel. Their discipline in combat was recognized even by their adversaries. The Templar Knights were forbidden by the very rule of the order from retreating before the enemy without express orders under penalty of expulsion. But the fortune of arms did not always follow the order's growing wealth. In 1187, the Muslim forces led by Sultan Saladin inflicted a devastating defeat on the Christian armies at the Battle of Hattin in the region of modern-day Galilee. Shortly after, Jerusalem itself, the greatest symbol of the entire Crusade enterprise, returned to Muslim hands. The Templars lost there not only soldiers and commanders, but the very spiritual heart of their foundation, the place that gave rise to their name. Over the next 105 years, Christians and Muslims would dispute inch by inch what remained of the territories conquered during the First Crusade. New expeditions set out from Europe, new battles were fought, and the Templars remained on the front lines, alongside another great military order, the Hospitaller Knights. But the Christian territory in the Middle East kept shrinking. Progressively, city after city, fortress after fortress. The final blow came in 1291, when the Mamluk forces besieged and took the city of Acre, the last great Christian bastion on the coast of the eastern Mediterranean. The fall of Acre marked, in practice, the end of nearly 200 years of organized Christian presence in the Holy Land. The survivors of the Templar garrison, along with thousands of refugees, embarked in haste for the island of Cyprus, which became the new seat of the order. It was at this moment that a silent question began to loom over the Templars, a question that, as the years passed, would become increasingly uncomfortable for the powerful in Europe. If the original mission of the order was to protect pilgrims and defend the Holy Land, and if the Holy Land no longer existed under Christian rule, what then would be the raison d'etre of an organization so vast, so rich, and so independent? The order continued to recruit knights, manage hundreds of estates, and move considerable sums of money across Europe. But the purpose that had justified all of this seemed to have vanished along with Acre. While the Templars were reorganizing in Cyprus, discussing plans for an eventual reconquest of the Holy Land, the political winds in continental Europe were blowing in another direction. And it is precisely at this point that the story begins to turn inward, to the palaces and chambers of French power, where a young king faced problems that had nothing to do with crusades, but which would eventually seal the fate of Christendom's richest order. Philip of France, later nicknamed the Fair by his contemporaries, had inherited a kingdom in constant financial tension. Wars against England and against the county of Flanders consumed resources at an accelerated rate. To try to balance the books, the king resorted at different times to the devaluation of the currency, which generated inflation and popular discontent, and also to more drastic measures. In 1306, he ordered the expulsion of the Jews from the kingdom, confiscating their assets and cancelling debts the crown owed them. Before that, he had already expelled and heavily taxed the Lombard bankers operating on French territory. Philip had also engaged in a direct confrontation with papal authority. In a dispute with Pope Boniface VIII over the crown's right to tax the French clergy, the king even sent agents who physically confronted the Pope on his own Italian territory, an episode that deeply shook the prestige of the Holy See. After the death of Boniface and his immediate successor, the papal throne was occupied, in 1305, by Clement V, a French archbishop elected under the strong influence of the crown. Shortly thereafter, the seat of the papacy would leave Rome to settle in Avignon, in the south of France, becoming geographically much closer to the sphere of influence of the French king. Indebted to the Templars themselves, who managed part of his finances and to whom he owed considerable sums, and observing the wealth accumulated by the order on French soil, Philip IV found himself facing a political and financial temptation difficult to ignore. The order owned hundreds of properties scattered throughout the kingdom, stocked coffers, tax exemptions guaranteed by the papacy, and an autonomy that placed it, in practice, beyond the direct reach of royal authority. It was rich. It was foreign in its ultimate loyalty, which belonged only to Rome, and it no longer visibly fulfilled the mission that had justified so many privileges. Over the previous years, rumors about secret practices within the order had circulated sparsely, fueled in part by the very close nature of its initiation rituals, always held behind closed doors, without the presence of outsiders. This secrecy, which for nearly 200 years had been merely a cultural trait of the order, became the raw material upon which advisors close to the king, such as the influential jurist Guillaume de Nogaret, they would construct an accusation capable of justifying, in the eyes of Europe, an unprecedented action. And so, in absolute secrecy, one of the most well-coordinated coups in European medieval history began to be prepared. In the final weeks of the summer of 1307, sealed letters were sent to bailiffs and royal officials in every region of France, with express instructions that they should only be opened on a specific date and not before. Inside them were detailed orders for the simultaneous arrest of all Templars in the kingdom, the confiscation of their properties, and the seizure of their documents. At dawn on Friday, October 13, 1307, these orders were finally executed. In cities and villages throughout France, royal agents raided Templar preceptories before daybreak, arresting knights, sergeants, chaplains, and administrators with practically no resistance. The Grand Master of the order himself, Jacques de Molay, who had returned from Cyprus at the king's invitation under the pretext of discussing plans for a new crusade, was captured in Paris, along with a good portion of the Templar leadership who were gathered in the capital at that moment. The choice of date was no mere coincidence, according to scholars who analyzed the operation decades later. The almost perfect synchrony between such distant regions reveals months of careful planning, something rare by the administrative standards of the time. In a single morning, an organization with almost 2 centuries of history, present in practically every corner of the kingdom, was almost completely neutralized. The formal accusations that justified the operation surprised even contemporaries due to their gravity. The Templars were accused of denying Christ during initiation rituals, of spitting or trampling upon the cross, of engaging in kisses considered obscene among the brethren, of venerating a mysterious idol, and of encouraging relationships considered immoral among the members themselves. Each of these accusations, taken individually, would already be sufficient to constitute heresy in the eyes of the medieval Inquisition, which cleared the legal path for arrest, torture, and the confiscation of assets. Subjected to interrogations conducted by royal inquisitors with the extensive use of physical torture, many Templars, including Jacques de Molay himself, ended up confessing to parts of the accusations in the first weeks of captivity. The methods employed included deprivation of food and water, forced stretching of limbs, and burning of the prisoners' feet, practices documented in the trial's own records. Under this type of pressure, confessions multiplied rapidly, providing the French crown with exactly the material it needed to publicly justify the action. News of the mass arrest shocked the rest of Europe, and also surprised in a non-trivial way Pope Clement V himself, who had not been previously consulted about an operation involving a religious order subject directly to his authority, and not that of kings. In the following weeks, the pontiff formally protested against what he classified as an invasion of ecclesiastical jurisdiction by French secular power. But the political pressure exerted by the crown, added to the weight of the confessions already obtained and widely publicized, made it increasingly difficult for the Pope to simply ignore the case or annul the proceedings. On November 22, 1307, little more than a month after the arrests in France, Clement V partially yielded to the pressure and issued the bull Pastoralis Praeeminentiae, instructing the other Christian sovereigns of Europe to also arrest the Templars present in their territories and confiscate their assets, placing the process, at least formally, under papal supervision. The reaction, however, varied enormously from kingdom to kingdom. In England, King Edward II initially resisted, considering the accusations implausible, and only arrested the knights under insistent pressure from Rome, treating them in general with much less rigor than in France. In territories of the Holy Roman Empire and on the Iberian Peninsula, many local trials simply did not find sufficient evidence to convict the accused, acquitting a good number of them. It was as if Europe were watching, at once fascinated and disturbed, the sudden collapse of an institution that, until a few months earlier, had seemed untouchable. As the trials dragged on across the continent, Clement V insisted on a demand that the French crown was reluctant to meet. He wanted to personally interrogate the order's top leadership, including Jacques de Molay himself, to form his own judgment on the veracity of the accusations. After months of negotiation, an intermediate solution was stitched together. In the summer of 1308, a large group of Templars was taken to the city of Poitiers, where papal commissioners would be permitted to hear them directly. Between June 28 and July 2 of that year, 72 knights were personally interrogated by representatives of the Pope. At the end of the process, all of them received full absolution, restored to the communion of the Church. There remained, however, a problem. The order's top leaders, including Molay, remained in the direct custody of the French crown, held in the castle of Chinon, and the king was reluctant to allow them to be brought into the Pope's presence. Faced with the impasse, Clement V sent 3 of his trusted cardinals to Chinon, with full powers to conduct right there the investigation that could not be carried out in Poitiers. Between August 17 and 20, 1308, within the walls of that French castle, one of the most decisive and for a long time least known episodes of this entire history took place. The cardinals heard, one by one, Jacques de Molay and the other high-ranking Templar dignitaries present, the preceptor of France, the preceptor of Aquitaine and Poitou, the preceptor of the East, and the preceptor of Normandy. After their confessions and formal requests for forgiveness, the papal representatives granted them all full absolution, reinstating them into the communion of the Church. For centuries, the exact existence of this document remained uncertain to historians, known only indirectly through references in other letters of the time. This changed dramatically in September 2001, when the Italian paleographer Barbara Fraile, researching in the Vatican secret archives, located the original parchment, today known as the Chinon parchment. The document confirmed, with all the formal details of a notary record of the time, that the Pope himself had, in secret, absolved the Templar leadership of the accusations of heresy. The discovery reignited decades of academic debate over the true intentions of Clement V. The records suggest that the Pope, at least at that moment in 1308, still hoped to preserve the order, perhaps by reforming it or merging it with another religious and military institution, rather than extinguishing it entirely. But this would not, as time would show, be the final word on the destiny of the Templars. The King of France continued to keep the prisoners in custody, and the process, despite the secret absolution in Chinon, would follow its course in the following years, driven less by the search for truth than by the interests of the crown. In 1310, an episode would mark a decisive breaking point within the process itself. Several Templars who had confessed under torture in the first interrogations began to recant publicly before ecclesiastical commissions, claiming that their confessions had been extracted by force and did not correspond to the truth. This wave of retractions represented a real risk to the prosecution. If accepted, they could collapse the entire legal basis built against the order. The response of the Archdiocese of Sens, under the control of a close ally of the king, was relentless. 54 Templars who had recanted were condemned as relapsed heretics and burned alive on the outskirts of Paris in a single day. The effect on the other prisoners was immediate and predictable. Practically no one dared to retract their confessions after that. Fear had become the most effective tool of the process, even more effective than the torture employed during the initial interrogations. It remained now to formally decide the fate of the order itself as an institution. For this, Clemente V summoned a great church council, which would meet in the city of Vienne in southeastern France, starting in October 1311. There, prelates from all of Christendom would debate, among other topics, the future of the Templarios. Curiously, even in the face of all the material gathered over 4 years of investigations, a good portion of the bishops present found no sufficient evidence to formally condemn the order for heresy. Faced with this internal resistance, and under renewed pressure from the French king, who personally arrived near Vienne during the council, Clemente V opted for an alternative path. Instead of declaring the Templarios guilty of heresy through a formal trial, the Pope used his full administrative power to simply extinguish the order by decree, citing the public scandal generated by the process and the practical impossibility of its continuation, regardless of proven guilt. On March 22, 1312, the bull Vox in Excelso officially declared the Ordem dos Templarios dissolved, ending nearly 200 years of history. Shortly thereafter, in May of that same year, a second papal bull called Ad Providam determined the destination that should be given to the vast patrimony of the extinguished order. Its properties, lands, and assets were to be transferred to another great military and religious order still in activity, the Cavalleros Hospitalarios, also known as the Ordem de Saint Juan. The decision made sense in the eyes of the Church. The Hospitalarios shared a similar origin, still maintained an active presence in the defense of Christian territories in the Mediterranean, and offered a destination that avoided the uncontrolled dispersal of assets that had been donated, over generations, to religious causes. In practice, however, the transfer was far from simple or immediate. In French territory, the Crown had kept most of the Templar assets under direct custody since the arrests of 1307, and Philippe IV did not intend to return them without first extracting considerable advantage from the process. Before releasing any property to the Hospitalarios, the king demanded reimbursement for alleged administrative expenses accumulated during the 5 years of custody, in addition to various fees and charges. The result was that a good part of the effective value of that patrimony had already been drained before even reaching the hands of the new beneficiary order, leaving the Hospitalarios with much less than the papal bull had originally envisioned. While these negotiations dragged on for years in different courts and royal chambers, there remained one last scene to unfold, perhaps the most striking of this entire long history. Jacques de Molay and other high dignitaries of the order remained imprisoned for 2 more years after the official dissolution, awaiting a final sentence on their personal fate. In March 1314, a papal commission met before a platform erected next to the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris to publicly announce the definitive punishment of the Templar leaders, life imprisonment, a relatively lenient sentence considering the gravity of the original accusations, since the condemned had confessed years earlier. It was at this moment that Jacques de Molay, then about 70 years of age, surprised everyone present. Before the gathered crowd, he stood up and publicly denied all the accusations made against the order, declaring that his previous confession had been extracted by force, and that the Templarios had never committed the crimes of which they were accused. Geoffroy de Charnay, preceptor of Normandy, made the same gesture of retraction at his side. Under the canon law of the time, retracting a confession already made constituted recidivism in heresy, a crime for which there was no possible forgiveness, only the stake. Felipe IV, informed of the episode practically on the same day, acted with unusual speed without even awaiting a new formal ecclesiastical trial. On the afternoon of the following day, March 18, 1314, Jacques de Molay and Geoffroy de Charnay were taken to a small island in the Seine River, near the spot where the statue of Henri IV stands today on the Ile de la Cité, and there they were burned alive before a crowd. Accounts written in the following decades, though not confirmed by direct documentation from the time, claim that Molay, already amidst the flames, summoned both Pope Clement V and King Felipe IV to appear before the tribunal of God within a year to answer for the injustice committed against the order. This is the origin of what would become known over the centuries as the Curse of Jacques de Molay. What is known based on concrete historical records is that the coincidence of the following events fueled this legend for generations. Clement V died exactly 33 days after the execution, victimized by an illness that had already affected him for some time. 7 months later, at the end of November of that same year of 1314, Felipe IV, then only 46 years old and in apparent full health, died suddenly after an accident during a hunt. In the following years, the three sons of Felipe IV would occupy the French throne one after the other, with none leaving a male heir who survived, extinguishing the ancient direct Capetian dynasty within a few decades, an episode that later chroniclers would christen the Curse of the Accursed Kings. There remained, however, a question that deeply interested contemporaries, and which continues to fascinate historians and the curious to this day. After all, what really happened to the immense wealth accumulated by the Templars over nearly 2 centuries? The answer, as frequently happens in history, proved to be much more complex and much less spectacular than the legends that would form in the following centuries. In Portugal, the outcome followed a path remarkably different from the rest of Europe. King Dinis, unlike Felipe IV, initially resisted the mass confiscation of Templar assets in his kingdom and refused to hand over the properties of the extinct order directly to the Hospitallers, as mandated by the papal bull. Instead, he initiated long diplomatic negotiations with Rome, arguing that the Portuguese kingdom needed to maintain a strong military order dedicated to the defense of the borders against incursions and the continuation of the fight against Moorish domains still present in the region. After years of negotiation, Pope John XXIII, successor to Clement V, yielded to the Portuguese request. On March 14, 1319, through the bull Ad Ea Ex Quibus, the Order of Christ was officially created, the direct heir to the assets, castles, and a good portion of the members themselves of the former Order of the Temple in Portuguese territory. Its first seat was established at the castle of Castro Marim, in the extreme south of the kingdom, but decades later it would be transferred definitively to Tomar, the old Templar fortress in the center of Portugal, which the new knights would reoccupy. This detail, apparently bureaucratic, would have historical consequences of enormous reach more than a century later. The Order of Christ maintained, throughout the following generations, substantial resources and properties, and in the 15th century it began to play a central role in financing Portuguese maritime expeditions. Infante Henrique himself, later known as the Navigator, held the position of Administrator General of the Order of Christ, using part of its resources to fund the first voyages of exploration along the African coast. The Portuguese caravels that set sail toward the unknown, paving the way for the so-called Age of Discovery, they displayed on their sails the Red Cross of the Order of Christ, a cross whose shape and symbolism traced back directly to the insignia used by the ancient Templars. In other words, although no secret and hidden treasure has been proven to have been transported to Portugal, the institutional, human, and symbolic heritage of the ancient order survived there in a documented and verifiable way, crossing the centuries and playing a real role in the history of the great navigations. A similar process, though less known, occurred in the Kingdom of Aragon, on the Iberian Peninsula. Faced with local resistance to handing over Templar assets to the Hospitallers, the Order of Montesa was created there a few years later, which absorbed a considerable part of the wealth that previously belonged to the Templars in that region, following a political logic very similar to the one adopted in Portugal. In England, Germany, and much of the Holy Roman Empire, the process proceeded more slowly and, generally speaking, less violently than in France. Many Templars arrested in these regions were simply released after a period of seclusion in monasteries, receiving life pensions for their subsistence, without ever being subjected to the same interrogation methods applied in French territory. Their properties, often disputed for years by local nobles who had already begun to occupy them informally shortly after the arrests, ended up being transferred to the Hospitallers gradually, through long legal processes that sometimes extended for more than a decade. The general picture that emerges from these different regional outcomes is one of a wealth that did not disappear mysteriously, but was in fact redistributed, negotiated, taxed, and, in many cases, considerably reduced throughout the process, through mechanisms perfectly documented in the royal and ecclesiastical archives of the time. And yet, a specific part of this history has remained shrouded in mist from the beginning, fueling over the following centuries one of the most persistent legends ever associated with the Templars, the story of the phantom fleet of La Rochelle. It all began with a fragment of testimony collected during the interrogations conducted in Poitiers in 1308. A knight named Jean de Chalon, when questioned by papal commissioners, mentioned having seen the preceptor Gérard de Villiers leaving the Temple of Paris in a hurry shortly before the arrests of October 1307, accompanied by 50 horses. Chalon further added having heard that Villiers had later departed toward the sea aboard 18 galleys, and that another Templar, Hugo de Chalon, had fled, taking with him part of the treasure under the responsibility of the preceptor, Hugo de Pyrode. It is important to note, and modern historians who have studied this passage in detail often make a point of highlighting this, that the original testimony of Jean de Chalon does not mention the name of the port of La Rochelle at any point. Chalon himself was reporting something he had heard from others, not something he had witnessed directly. And the supposed commander of the Templar fleet, Raimbaud de Caron, was, according to other records of the same trial, imprisoned on land in Paris, along with the other leaders captured on the dawn of the arrests, which makes it unlikely that he was simultaneously in command of a fleet fleeing across the Atlantic. The specific association with the port of La Rochelle would only arise gradually over the following centuries, as chroniclers, writers, and researchers reconstructed and expanded that original fragment of testimony, adding to it details, dates, and locations that the original trial documents simply did not contain. La Rochelle was, in fact, a port of known Templar presence, but used according to the trade records of the time, mostly for the transport of wine and other goods, not as a main naval base for the order, which concentrated its Mediterranean fleet primarily in Marseille, the port closest to the routes connecting Europe to the Holy Land and, later, to Cyprus. Still, the image became etched in the popular imagination, 18 ships stealthily leaving the French port in the dead of the night before the arrests, carrying with them fugitive knights, secret archives, and above all the legendary Templar treasure, bound for a destination never revealed. From the 20th century onwards, this version would gain even more strength through widely popular books that presented the fleet's escape as an established historical fact, when in reality it was a speculative reconstruction based on indirect and fragmentary evidence. Historians specializing in the Order of the Temple, such as the French medievalist Alain de Mourget, one of the greatest contemporary scholars on the subject, assess that the disappearance of the fleet from La Rochelle is, much more likely, a legend constructed a posteriori than a real episode. According to this analysis, any surplus of wealth that the order still possessed in 1307 very likely remained in the form of lands, buildings, and credits recorded on paper, not in portable chests of physical gold ready for shipment, which makes the very idea of a sea escape loaded with treasure logistically implausible by the administrative standards of the time. But the absence of historical proof has never prevented a good story from continuing to spread and transform, and that is exactly what happened with the Templar treasure in the centuries following the extinction of the order. One of the oldest legends associates the supposed treasure with the castle of Gisors in Normandy, France, an ancient fortress that for a certain period housed a Templar preceptory. Over the centuries, amateur excavations and unconfirmed accounts have fueled the popular belief that secret chambers beneath the castle might still hold part of the riches hidden by the order before its extinction, although no solid archaeological evidence has ever supported this hypothesis. Another strand of the legend follows a very different direction, pointing to the Swiss Alps. According to this version, Templar knights allegedly sought refuge in isolated valleys of present-day Switzerland, a region that, at the time, maintained relative autonomy from the great European crowns. Some enthusiasts of the subject go so far as to suggest a symbolic link between the arrival of potential fugitive Templars and the subsequent development of the Swiss banking tradition, an association which, it is worth noting, lacks any solid documentary basis, recognized by academic historiography, but which continues to circulate strongly in popular culture on the subject. A third line of legends heads towards Scotland. At that period, the Scottish King Robert the Bruce found himself excommunicated by the Catholic Church due to territorial and succession disputes with England, which placed Scotland, in practice, beyond the direct reach of the papal authority that was driving the proceedings against the Templars in the rest of Europe. Some popular accounts without documentary proof contemporary to the events suggest that refugee Templar knights had found shelter precisely there, and that some of them had even fought alongside Scottish forces in the decisive Battle of Bannockburn, fought in June 1314, a few months after the execution of Jacques de Molay. This supposed Scottish connection would, over the centuries, also become associated with Rosslyn Chapel, built in the 15th century, whose elaborate decorative carvings have fueled, especially from the 20th century onwards, theories that seek to link it to a supposed hidden Templar legacy, again without any contemporary historical basis to support such a connection. On the other side of the Atlantic, in much more recent times, yet another would emerge, a branch of these legends, this one completely disconnected from any direct historical evidence. The popular association between the Templars and the so-called Money Pit on Oak Island in present-day Canada, where treasure hunters have been searching since the late 18th century for a supposed hoard of riches of uncertain origin. Although the media and popular culture frequently associate this site with the Templars, there is absolutely no historical, archaeological, or documentary evidence that actually links the Order of the Temple, dissolved in 1312, to an island that was not even known to Europeans until centuries later. It is also worth noting that much of these legends gained additional momentum starting in the 18th century, when Freemasonry, expanding in Europe and the American colonies, began to incorporate into some of its symbolic rites references and images associated with the ancient Templars, in an attempt to bestow upon the Masonic fraternity a supposed ancestral historical lineage dating back to the Middle Ages. Specialized historians are, generally speaking, categorical in stating that there is no documented continuity between the Order of the Temple, dissolved in 1312, and modern Freemasonry, which would only emerge in an organized fashion centuries later in early 18th century England. The connection is symbolic and cultural, not historical or genealogical. Faced with so many versions, so many possible directions, and so many generations of treasure hunters who have scoured castles, caves, and islands in search of buried Templar coffers, perhaps it is time to gather what is effectively known, based on documents and preserved records, about the real fate of such legendary wealth. The vast majority of historians specializing in the subject converge on a conclusion that, although less spectacular than popular legends, is supported by solid documentary evidence. There was no secret physical treasure hidden at some specific point on the map, waiting to be discovered. The true patrimony of the Templars was, in its essence, composed of lands, castles, recorded financial credits, and a complex administrative network spread throughout Europe, rather than portable coffers of gold ready to be shipped away in secret. Whatever the French crown failed to confiscate directly in 1307 was, over the following years, absorbed through different perfectly traceable paths. A considerable part remained retained by King Philip IV himself under the pretext of the administrative costs of the trial. Part was effectively transferred, albeit reduced, to the Knights Hospitaller, as determined by the papal bull Ad Providum, and a significant portion, especially in Portugal and Aragon, followed a documented institutional trajectory, being incorporated by new local military orders that absorbed both the assets and a good portion of the former Templar members themselves. The true legacy of the Order of the Temple, many contemporary historians argue, should not be sought in a vault buried beneath some forgotten castle, but rather in the very financial system it helped to develop. The practices of credit transfer, custody of assets, and decentralized resource management that the Templars perfected over nearly 2 centuries left a lasting mark on the way medieval and subsequently modern Europe would come to think about money, trust, and distance. Today, those who walk through the Ile de la Cité in the heart of Paris can find, near the bridge that leads to the old Palais de la Cité, a discreet commemorative plaque that marks approximately the site where Jacques de Molay was burned in March 1314. It is a modest monument, almost hidden amidst the daily bustle of the modern city, a silent contrast to the magnitude of the history that ended there 700 years ago. And perhaps it is precisely this contrast between the legendary grandeur of the supposed treasure lost and the documented sobriety of the actual historical archives which continues to fuel, generation after generation, the public's fascination with this story. Not because there is a lack of truth to be told, but because the truth so often reveals itself to be even richer in nuances and twists than any legend could invent. The rise of 9 poor knights to bankers of kings, the sudden fall orchestrated by an indebted monarch, the secret absolution kept for 700 years within the archives of the Vatican itself, and the unexpected survival of part of that legacy in the sails of the caravels that would open, decades later, the maritime routes to the rest of the world. If there is a truly Templar treasure yet to be discovered, perhaps it is not buried under any castle, island, or Scottish chapel, but rather dispersed among thousands of pages of parchment, filed away in libraries and historical archives scattered across Europe, many of them still barely studied, awaiting researchers willing to continue this investigation that, 700 years later, has not truly come to an end. And this investigation, like every good quest for answers, gains more strength when it is shared. If this journey through the archives, the bonfires, and the seas of the Middle Ages has sparked in you the same curiosity that drives historians and researchers to this day, subscribe to the channel to continue exploring the mysteries that official history left half open. Leave a like to help more people find this narrative, and tell us in the comments which of these clues, the lost fleet, the secret parchment, or the sails of the Ordem de Cristo, most piqued your interest. The next piece of this puzzle may be just one video away, and it will be a pleasure to continue this investigation by your side.